The Knock at the Window, Part 1, January 2nd, 1999. It was just past 2 a.m. when she heard it. Not loud, not frantic, just a quiet, deliberate knock on the glass. 3 soft taps. Carol Whitaker sat up in bed, heart thudding, eyes straining through the dark. The storm outside had been rattling the windows for hours. Howling wind, sleet against the roof. But this was different. It was a human sound, and it came from the kitchen. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her breath catching as her feet met the cold wooden floor. The power had gone out earlier that evening. No light, no heat, and the old farmhouse had turned into an icebox. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. She didn't turn it on yet. Instead, she listened. Nothing. Then, knock, knock, knock. Steady, measured. Not hurried, not panicked. Just enough to make your skin crawl. Carol crept down the hallway, flashlight clenched in her hand like a weapon. The creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet felt deafening in the silence. She passed the coat rack, the empty hallway mirror, the old photo of her and Mark on their wedding day, August 12th, 1966. He'd been gone 5 years now. Heart failure, quick, brutal, lonely. The dog, Duke, a black lab mix, had lifted his head from his spot near the hearth when she passed. But he didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just looked at her and whimpered once. That's what unsettled her the most. The kitchen window faced the backyard. Just beyond it, a tree line and an old fence that once kept in chickens. She approached slowly, flicked on the flashlight, and aimed it toward the glass. Nothing. Only snow and darkness. She inched closer, and then she saw it. A handprint, faint but fresh, pressed against the outer glass. She stepped back instinctively. "Hello?" she called, her voice cracked. "Is someone there?" No answer. She unlocked the back door, opened it a crack, and let the beam of the flashlight sweep across the porch and the steps. Then she saw him. A boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, sitting on the frozen steps, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes wide and terrified. His clothes were soaked, his hair matted, his lips blue. "Dear God," Carol whispered. She rushed forward, pulling her coat from the wall as she moved. The boy didn't speak, didn't cry. He just looked at her like she was the first person he'd seen in 100 miles. Carol wrapped the coat around his shoulders and ushered him inside, straight toward the fireplace. "Duke," she said almost involuntarily, "stay close." The boy collapsed onto the rug in front of the cold hearth. She threw 2 logs in and lit a match, thanking God she'd laid them earlier. The room began to glow. She turned to the boy. "Sweetheart, what's your name?" He didn't answer. She knelt beside him. "Where's your family?" Still nothing. Only those wide, haunted eyes. And then, with a voice barely audible, he said one word. "Ben." Part 2. The boy named Ben. Carol knelt on the floor beside him, gently pulling the soaked coat tighter around his shoulders. The fire crackled softly now, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Duke lay nearby, head on his paws, ears alert. The boy didn't shiver anymore, but he didn't move either. She tried again. "Ben, my name is Carol. You're safe now. Do you understand?" He nodded slightly, just once. His skin was pale, and there were tiny red marks along his hands, like scratches or frostbite. His shoes were worn thin, laces undone, and his jeans were soaked past the knees. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. Ben didn't answer. Instead, his eyes darted to the window, the same one he'd knocked on, Carol followed his gaze, uneasy. "Ben," she said, gently cupping his shoulder. "Are you hurt? Did someone hurt you?" His lips parted. "I ran." "From where?" He shook his head slowly. She didn't press. After a few minutes, she brought out a blanket from the hall closet and wrapped it around him, then headed to the kitchen to warm up some milk on the gas stove. The power was still out, but gas was one thing the storm hadn't taken. When she returned with the warm cup, he took it in trembling hands. His eyes never left the fire. They sat in silence. Outside, the wind screamed against the windows. Trees bent in the gale. The roads were impassable, drifts already piled 3 feet high in places. She wouldn't be calling anyone tonight. Around 3:30 a.m., Carol rose to check the front and back doors. Both locked. She peeked out the front window. Nothing but swirling snow. But the boy, Ben, he had come from somewhere, and not long ago. She sat down at the table and stared at the rotary phone. It was dead. No dial tone. Likely, the lines were down from the ice. She looked back toward the living room, where Ben now dozed near the fire. Duke curled around him like a sentry. She frowned. There were questions, too many, but they would have to wait. For now, the only thing that mattered was warmth, safety, quiet. As dawn approached, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Carol, exhausted, leaned back in her chair, watching the flames. Her mind drifted toward Mark, how he would have reacted, how calm he always was in a crisis, and how he would have trusted the dog's instinct. Because Duke hadn't barked, hadn't growled, he'd let the boy in. She rose quietly, went to the fire, and gently adjusted the blanket around Ben's shoulders. His eyes fluttered open, just for a moment. "Thank you," he whispered. Carol smiled softly. "You're safe here," she said again. "I promise." But deep down, something inside her still twisted, because kids don't just appear out of nowhere, not in the middle of a blizzard, not barefoot and silent, not with eyes like that. Part 3. The road behind him. When the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, it did so like a quiet apology. Pale light fell across the snow-covered fields, illuminating a world carved in ice and silence. Carol hadn't slept. She made oatmeal on the stove and set a bowl near the fire. Ben sat cross-legged now, draped in blankets, watching the steam rise. "Are you hungry?" she asked gently. He nodded. Bit by bit, trust began to form, not with words, but with small things. He ate without flinching, let her wipe dirt from his forehead, allowed Duke to rest his chin on his knee without recoiling. She sat nearby, watching carefully. "Ben," she asked softly, "do you live around here?" He didn't answer, but after a long pause he said, "I was with my mom." Carol's heart jumped. "Where is she now?" Another pause. "We were driving. There was a tree. We crashed." "Where?" He looked toward the window. "I think back there, in the woods." Carol rose, pacing near the stove. The county road behind her house wasn't well traveled, especially during a storm. If a car had gone off the road last night, it might still be buried under snow, unseen. She glanced at the rotary phone again. Still dead. No way to call the sheriff. No way to get an ambulance. And the roads were still impossible by car. She looked down at Duke. The old dog stared back, ears perked. By 9 a.m., Carol bundled Ben in a fresh coat, Mark's old winter parka, and layered him with scarves and mittens. She packed a thermos of soup, wrapped herself in her thickest coat, and clipped Duke's leash to his collar. "I'm going to need your nose today, boy," she said, scratching behind his ears. Ben hesitated near the door. "You don't have to come," she told him gently. "You're safe here." But he shook his head. "I want to go." They stepped into the cold together. The wind had calmed, but the snow came up nearly to Carol's knees in places. The trees groaned under the weight of ice. Visibility had improved, but the landscape was unrecognizable, flattened by the storm, paths erased. They walked in silence for half a mile, retracing where Ben might have come from. Duke led the way, nose to the ground, tail stiff. Then he stopped, ears forward, body tense. They reached a narrow bend in the tree line. Snow had formed a hard-packed ridge on the edge of the embankment, and there, barely visible, was the glint of metal beneath a tangle of branches. A car. Carol stumbled forward, heart racing. It was a dark green sedan, nearly buried. The windshield was cracked. One door hung slightly open. A woman's purse was half buried in the snow nearby. She cupped her hands around her mouth. "Hello, can anyone hear me?" No reply. Ben stood frozen. Carol opened the passenger side door. The seat was empty. She moved to the driver's side and pulled hard. The door creaked. Inside, the air was stale and bitterly cold. And on the driver's seat, streaked with blood, was a woman's coat. Ben took one look and started to cry. Part 4. The Woman in the Woods. Carol wrapped her arms around Ben as he sobbed, his small body shaking beneath the weight of what he already feared to be true. Duke sat beside them, his tail still, his eyes fixed on the trees beyond the wreck. "We don't know anything yet," Carol whispered, though her own heart was sinking. The driver's side was splattered with blood. The keys were still in the ignition. The seatbelt was buckled but cut clean through. Carol glanced toward the woods. If Ben's mother had been injured and able to move, maybe, just maybe, she'd gone looking for help. She had to believe that. "Ben, listen," she said gently. "I'm going to look around. You stay here with Duke." He hesitated. "Don't leave me." Her heart caught. She knelt and placed both hands on his shoulders. "I won't go far. I promise. Duke's with you, and I'll stay where you can see me, all right?" He nodded, eyes red. She stood and began toward the trees. The woods were heavy with silence. Every branch was crusted in white. Her boots cracked through frozen layers of ice and leaves. She called out, over and over, "Hello, anyone out here? Can you hear me?" No response. But then, 20 yards deeper in, she saw it, a red scarf, hanging from a low branch. Carol's breath caught. She hurried toward it and spotted something just beyond, a mound in the snow, the shape of a person, half buried. She dropped to her knees. It was a woman, brown hair, pale face, lips tinged purple. Her hands were scratched raw, nails broken, like she had crawled through brush. Her coat was stiff with blood, one sleeve torn completely off, but she was breathing, faint, shallow, alive. Carol shouted toward the road. "Ben, she's here! She's alive!" She reached for her scarf and wrapped it tightly around the woman's chest, trying to shield her from the cold. Then she bolted back to the road, waving her arms. "Ben, come here!" The boy ran, Duke close behind. When he saw her lying there, he collapsed beside her. "Mom!" Her eyes fluttered open, just a sliver. She smiled, weakly, but unmistakably. "Ben." Tears streamed down his cheeks. Carol pressed her hand to the woman's wrist. Still a pulse. Weak, but steady. "We're getting you home," she whispered. They worked quickly. Carol didn't have a sled, no stretcher, nothing but coats and blankets. She laid the woman onto a tarp from the trunk of the car, wrapped her tight, and with Duke's help, tugging on the leash, leading the way, they dragged her slowly back toward the house. Every 10 feet, they paused. Carol's muscles screamed. Her breath came in clouds, but they moved forward, step by agonizing step. Ben held her hand the whole way. When they finally reached the porch, Carol collapsed to her knees. Inside, the fire was still alive. She brought every blanket, every pillow, and laid the woman near the flames. She rubbed her hands, her face, her arms. Warm soup and dripped it into her lips. By evening, her eyes opened fully. She squeezed Carol's wrist. "Thank you." Carol smiled through tears. "You're home," she whispered. Part 5. What Came Before. That night, as snow continued to fall gently over the roof of the farmhouse, the power returned with a sudden hum. Lamps flickered on. The refrigerator buzzed. The radio in the kitchen sputtered back to life. But Carol didn't move from her place near the hearth. The boy, Ben, was asleep now, curled up on the floor beside Duke, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. His mother, wrapped in quilts, lay beside the fire, cheeks regaining color, her eyes closed in true rest. Carol stayed up, just watching them. She still didn't know their last name. It wasn't until morning that the woman spoke clearly. Her voice was rough, lips cracked from cold, but the words came. "My name's Dana Miller." Carol nodded gently. "I'm Carol Whitaker. You're safe here." Dana blinked slowly. "Where's Ben?" Carol motioned toward the dog bed, where Ben still slept, Duke tucked in tight beside him. "He hasn't left your side." A pause. Then, "I didn't think we'd make it." The story came slowly. She and Ben had been driving from Billings to Spokane. A last-minute trip to see her sister, she said, trying to get away from a situation. She didn't elaborate at first, but Carol knew the weight behind that phrase. The storm hit outside Shelby. Visibility dropped to nothing. She took a wrong turn onto an unplowed county road. When the tree fell, she'd swerved and rolled the car into the ditch. She'd hit her head, blacked out. When she came to, Ben was crying in the passenger seat, shaking her awake. Then the cold set in. They had no cell service, no flashlight, no supplies. She cut the seatbelt with her keychain knife, pushed Ben out of the car, and told him to follow the fence line until he found help. "Why didn't you stay in the car?" Carol asked softly. Dana looked away. "I knew I was bleeding inside. If I died with him next to me, he'd be trapped. He wouldn't know what to do. I needed him to keep moving." Carol felt the tears in her throat. "You told him to knock on a window?" Dana nodded. "I said, don't stop until someone answers." Later that day, when the landlines were restored, Carol called the sheriff's office in Havre. Deputies arrived in snowplows by late afternoon. They'd been searching for a green sedan since the night before. A missing persons bulletin had gone out just hours earlier. When they heard how Ben had navigated 2 miles through snowdrifts and woods to knock on a stranger's window, one officer simply removed his hat and said, "That boy has angels walking with him." Carol smiled faintly. "Not angels," she said. "Just a mother who told him to keep going." Part 6. The Weight of Silence. The news spread quickly, as it always did in towns like Havre. By morning, the local paper had a headline waiting. "Boy survives blizzard to save his mother. A knock that saved 2 lives." A reporter from the Great Falls Tribune called Carol for a statement, but she declined. She wasn't interested in the spotlight. The only thing that mattered now was that Dana was healing, and Ben was sleeping through the night without flinching at the wind. But the story had already moved beyond them. 2 days later, a deputy came by to return the belongings recovered from the car. A wallet, a photograph of Ben and Dana at a lake, and something else. A manila envelope with court documents inside. Carol hadn't asked, but Dana explained quietly. her voice flat with exhaustion. They were leaving more than just weather behind. Dana had been fleeing an abusive partner, the kind who smiled in public and screamed when the door shut. She hadn't wanted to risk taking Ben through official channels. There had been threats, manipulation, loopholes in the system. So she waited. And when she saw the window of escape, she took it. It was stupid, she said, her voice tight with guilt. No plan, just go. Carol didn't judge. She simply poured another cup of tea and said, "You did what mothers do. You moved." That night, after Ben had gone to sleep, Carol found herself staring out the same window where he had knocked days earlier. She pressed her palm to the glass, mirroring the faint handprint that was still barely visible in the frost. And she remembered another winter, another knock. It had been years ago, December 1994. Mark had collapsed while chopping wood. She was out running errands, and by the time she returned, he was cold, unresponsive. He remembered kneeling in the snow, screaming his name. Remembered pounding on a neighbor's door barefoot, her hands bleeding from the ice. It was the last knock she made as a wife. Since then, she'd stopped expecting rescue, stopped believing anyone might knock for her. Until that night, when a boy with snow in his hair and eyes full of fear changed everything. By the end of the week, Dana was strong enough to walk without help. Deputies arranged temporary lodging for her at a women's shelter in Helena. Paperwork was being filed. Her sister was on her way from Spokane. Things were moving forward. Before they left, Dana turned to Carol in the doorway. "You saved us," she said. Carol shook her head. "No, you saved each other. I just opened the door." Ben ran back and hugged Carol tightly. "I'll write you letters," he said. "I'd like that," she smiled. Then he reached down and gave Duke a final pat on the head. "Good boy." The old lab thumped his tail once, as if in salute. Part 7. The Warmest Light. Winter faded slowly in Montana that year. February brought gray skies and slush. March added icy rain and cracked roads. But inside Carol Whitaker's farmhouse, something had changed. The silence was no longer heavy. She found herself humming again as she stirred her morning coffee. She took Duke on longer walks. She even started leaving the porch light on at night. Not because she feared the dark, but because, just maybe, someone might need it. And then, one afternoon in April, the first letter came, written in blue ink. The handwriting shaky but proud. "Dear Miss Carol, thank you for letting me and Mom stay with you. I am doing good in Spokane. I have my own room. Mom got a job. She smiles more now. I miss Duke. Love, Ben." Carol read it twice, then 3 more times. She pinned it to the refrigerator with a faded photo magnet of Glacier National Park. A week later came another letter, this one from Dana. Longer, more serious. She wrote about court hearings, about starting over, about the quiet joy of not being afraid when someone knocks at the door. "You didn't just save us from the storm," she wrote. "You reminded me I wasn't alone." That spring, Carol had the kitchen window replaced. Not because it was broken, but because the cold draft had become unbearable. She saved the old glass. It now rests on a wooden stand in her living room, framed in cedar. At the center, faint but visible, is the small smudge of a handprint. Below it, on a bronze plaque, January 2nd, 1999, he knocked, she opened, they survived. Neighbors still ask about the boy, about the woman in the snow, about the blizzard that nearly took 2 lives but gave back so much more. Carol tells the story simply, without embellishment, and when she finishes, she always says the same thing. It wasn't just the knock that mattered. It was that someone chose to answer. In a world so often filled with noise, it is the quiet moments that reveal the most. A knock, a handprint, a cry for help in the dark. Sometimes the smallest sound holds the greatest weight. And sometimes the greatest thing you can do is open the door. If this story moved you, like this video, leave a comment. We read every word. Subscribe for more true, powerful stories that matter. Your support helps us keep sharing stories like this one. Thank you for listening.